Most people believe the plan is simple. Work hard, get noticed, get promoted, earn more. That is the formula. That is what every parent, every teacher, every career counselor has ever told you. And it is not wrong exactly. It is incomplete. And that incompleteness is costing the average working person somewhere between $1 and $3 million over the course of their working life. The plan was never designed to make you wealthy. It was designed to make you useful. There is a difference, a very expensive difference. Warren Buffett understood this at an age when most people are still figuring out what they want to be when they grow up. His documented financial history shows a person who made one foundational decision early, a decision that separated his trajectory from virtually everyone around him. Not a decision about what to invest in, a decision about what kind of income to build. Most people spend 40 years optimizing the wrong thing. They optimize their salary. They negotiate raises. They chase promotions. They move companies for an extra $12,000 a year. And at the end of those 40 years, the data shows the average person retires with less than $100,000 in total savings. Not because they were lazy, not because they were unintelligent, because they were playing a game that was mathematically designed to prevent them from winning it. This video is about why the salary is a trap, not a bad trap, not an evil trap, a structural trap, built into the architecture of how the modern economy works. And more importantly, this video is about the specific mechanism Buffett used, documented, historical, replicable, to step outside that structure before it could fully close around him. If you stop watching now, you will keep the plan. You will keep working. You will keep getting raises. And 20 years from now, you will sit across from a retirement calculator and feel a specific cold feeling that you cannot quite name. Stay. Because the thing nobody told you about the plan is worth understanding. Think about a vending machine. You walk up. You put in $1. You get one item. You put in $5. You get 5 items. The relationship is fixed. 1 unit in, 1 unit out. Perfectly predictable. Perfectly linear. That is a salary. You put in 1 hour of your life and you receive 1 unit of pay. You put in 8 hours and you receive 8 units. You put in 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, for 40 years, and you receive exactly the number of units the machine was programmed to give you, not one more. The machine has a maximum input. You cannot put in 25 hours in a day. You cannot put in 8 days in a week. The machine is physically capped, and because the input is capped, the output is capped. Your income has a ceiling built into it by the laws of time itself. There is no version of working harder that breaks through that ceiling. You can only rearrange what happens below it. Now think about a different kind of machine. A machine that runs whether you are standing in front of it or not. A machine that produces output while you sleep, while you are sick, while you are on a beach somewhere watching your children grow up. A machine that the longer it runs, the faster it runs, because it uses its own output as fuel. Buffett has referred to this as making money while you sleep. People have put that phrase on motivational posters and completely missed the engineering behind it. He was not talking about passive income as a lifestyle concept. He was describing the mechanical difference between 2 types of financial systems. One that stops the moment you stop, and one that does not. The salary is the first machine. The asset is the second. Every financial decision Buffett's documented history reveals comes down to one repeated question. Is this thing I am building going to keep running when I walk away from it? If the answer is no, it is a job. If the answer is yes, it is wealth. Here is what nobody explains when you start your first job. The tax code of every major developed economy is written to punish salary income and reward asset income. This is not a conspiracy. It is a documented structural feature. And it is the single most important piece of financial information you were never taught in school. If you earn a salary, the government takes its share first, before the money reaches your account. Income tax, payroll tax, Social Security contributions. Depending on your bracket in your country, between 25 and 40% of every dollar you earn disappears before you see it. Buffett has publicly documented that he pays a lower effective tax rate than his own secretary. When he said this, people heard it as a political statement. It was not. It was a technical observation about how the tax code is structured. Salary income is taxed at the highest rate. Capital gains income, money earned from assets, is taxed at a significantly lower rate, sometimes half. The code was written this way because economies need capital deployment. They need people to build businesses and buy productive assets. They do not need more people sitting at desks. So the code subsidizes the behavior it wants and penalizes the behavior it does not need more of. You were not taught this in school because the people who designed the school curriculum needed employees. They needed people who would arrive on time, complete assigned tasks, and not ask uncomfortable questions about where the money actually flows. This is not your fault. The map you were given was drawn by people who needed you to go to a specific destination. That destination was useful to them. It was not designed to be useful to you. You were not given the wrong result. You were given the wrong map. Think back to your first real paycheck. Not the number they told you when you were hired, the number that actually arrived. You remember looking at those two figures, the gross amount at the top, the number you had been calculating in your head, planning your life around, and then the net amount at the bottom, the number that was actually yours. You remember that specific feeling, that quiet confusion. Where did the rest go? You worked every hour. You did everything correctly. And somewhere between what you earned and what you received, a significant portion simply vanished into a system you did not design, did not vote for, and were never properly explained. That gap, that distance between what you produced and what you kept, does not close as your career progresses. It widens. Because as your salary grows, you move into higher tax brackets. The marginal dollar of every raise you receive is taxed at a higher rate than the dollars before it. You worked harder to earn more. And the system took a larger percentage of the increase as a reward for your effort. Most people feel this but cannot name it. They just know that no matter how much their salary grows, the sense of financial freedom never quite arrives. That feeling is not a personal failing. It is an accurate perception of a structural mechanism working exactly as it was designed to work. The first chain, the ceiling you cannot see. Most people believe that the solution to financial stress is a higher salary. This feels logical. If the problem is not enough money coming in, more money coming in should solve the problem. But there is a ceiling built into salary income that no raise can break through. And the ceiling is not about the amount, it is about the structure. Documented research into the financial lives of high earners shows a consistent and troubling pattern. Physicians earning $400,000 a year retire with less wealth than plumbers earning $60,000 who started investing at 22. Senior executives at major corporations earning salaries most people cannot imagine routinely reach 60 with almost nothing liquid outside their pension. This is not about discipline, it is about architecture. A salary grows linearly. One more hour produces one more unit of pay. One more year of experience produces one more percentage point of raise. The growth is real, but it is additive. It adds. It never multiplies. Wealth is not built by addition. Wealth is built by multiplication. And the salary, by its mechanical structure, cannot multiply. It can only add. Buffett's documented investment philosophy has never been built around earning more. It has been built around deploying what is earned into systems that multiply. The distinction sounds small. Over 40 years, it produces a difference of millions. The second chain, the inflation ambush. There is a second force working against salary earners that is quieter than the tax structure and more insidious. Inflation. Most people understand inflation as prices going up. That is correct, but incomplete. The mechanism that matters is the sequence in which inflation moves through the economy. When money supply expands, prices do not all rise simultaneously. Asset prices rise first. The stock market reprices upward. Real estate values increase. The people who own those assets become wealthier immediately, in real time as the inflation occurs. Consumer prices rise second. Bread, petrol, rent, groceries, the things that salary earners spend their money on. Wages rise last. Wages are what economists describe as sticky. Your employer does not receive an inflation notification and immediately adjust your compensation. Your employer waits. 1 year, sometimes 2. By the time your salary reflects the inflation that has already occurred, that inflation has already spent 12 to 24 months eroding your purchasing power. You are running a race where the finish line is moving away from you faster than you are running toward it. Buffett's documented position on this has been consistent for decades. The only reliable protection against inflation is ownership of productive assets. Things that reprice upward when money supply expands. Not salary, not savings accounts. Ownership. Every year that passes while your wealth is held entirely in salary income is a year in which inflation is quietly taxing you in a way that never appears on any statement. The third chain, the story of Marcus and David. Consider two men. Same age, same city, same starting salary. Marcus is 26 years old. He works in account management at a mid-sized company. He earns $52,000 a year. He is good at his job. He gets a 4% raise every 18 months. By 35, he is earning $71,000. By 42, he is earning $94,000. His colleagues respect him. His lifestyle has expanded to match his income at every stage. He drives a car that reflects his position. He lives in an apartment that reflects his success. He has approximately $18,000 in savings at 42. He feels most mornings like he is almost there, almost financially stable, almost ahead. David is 26 years old. He works at the same company. He earns the same $52,000. On the day he receives his first paycheck, he makes one decision. He redirects $300 a month, not from his savings, from his spending, into a low-cost index fund that tracks the broad market. He does not think about it again. He does not watch it daily. He does not move it around. He just lets it run. David gets the same raises as Marcus. David's lifestyle also improves over time, but the $300 a month never changes. It runs in the background like a machine he forgot he built. At 42, David has approximately $140,000 in that account. Not because $300 a month is a large amount, because 16 years of compound growth at average market returns turns $300 a month into something that no longer resembles its origin. The difference between Marcus and David at 42 is not intelligence. It is not discipline. It is not income. It is one decision made on one afternoon at age 26. Marcus spent the $300. David deployed it. By 55, that gap does not look like $122,000 anymore. It looks like the difference between working because you have to and working because you choose to. This is not a story about index funds. This is a story about the only question that matters when money arrives in your account. Are you sending it to work, or are you sending it to die? The fourth chain, the addiction nobody names. There is a psychological dimension to the salary trap that is rarely discussed honestly. A regular paycheck does something specific to the human brain. It triggers a predictable dopamine response. Safety, certainty, the knowledge that on a specific date, a specific amount will arrive. The brain organizes itself around that rhythm. It begins to require it. Over time, life expands to consume that certainty. A mortgage calibrated to that income. A car payment sized to that paycheck. A lifestyle built precisely to the edges of what that salary provides. The predictability that felt like security becomes a cage. Because the moment the paycheck stops, through redundancy, through illness, through a company that no longer needs your specific skill, everything built around it becomes immediately fragile. Buffett's documented career shows a deliberate and early rejection of this dependency. His choice at 26 to begin building capital structures outside his earned income was not primarily a financial decision. It was a decision about what he would and would not allow himself to need. The people who build real wealth, the historical record shows, are not the people who earned the most. They are the people who maintained the smallest possible gap between what they needed and what their assets could provide. Every dollar that gap shrinks is a dollar of freedom purchased back from the system. Most people spend their careers widening that gap, earning more and needing more in exact proportion, arriving at 60 with a high income and almost no assets, and wondering why financial freedom never came. It never came because it was never the salary's job to provide it. Understanding the trap is the first step. Here's the exit. This is not a dramatic plan. It does not require quitting your job. It does not require starting a business this weekend. It requires 3 decisions made in a specific sequence. Step 1. This week, take 10% of your next paycheck. Not 50%, not 30%, 10%. If 10% feels impossible, take 5. The amount is almost irrelevant at this stage. What matters is the habit of directing money toward deployment before directing it toward consumption. Open a separate account if you do not have one. Label it something that reminds you it is not available for spending. Transfer the money the day your paycheck arrives, before you see it sitting in your main account. Automation removes the decision. Remove the decision and you remove the friction. This 10% is not savings. It is the beginning of a capital structure. It is the first soldier in an army you are building. It does not feel significant today. That is exactly correct. Buffett's documented early capital accumulation did not feel significant either. It was $300 here, $500 there. The significance is not in the amount, it is in the direction. Step 2. Over the next 90 days, learn the difference between an asset and a liability, not as a concept. As a filter you apply to every purchase above $100. An asset puts money into your account over time. A liability takes money out. A car is a liability. A share of a business is an asset. A subscription you rarely use is a liability. A skill that increases your earning power is an asset. Before every significant purchase for the next 90 days, ask one question. Is this thing going to be worth more or less in 5 years? And is it going to put money in my account or take money out? This question does not prevent all spending. It makes spending conscious. Conscious spending is the beginning of capital intelligence. Step 3. The long game. The documented evidence from Buffett's investment history shows one consistent principle above all others. Time in the market matters more than timing the market. The people who built wealth through asset ownership were not smarter than the people who did not. They started earlier and they did not stop. The third step is simply to not stop, not when the market drops, not when your income temporarily decreases, not when a better opportunity appears to distract you. The machine that keeps running while you are not watching it is only valuable if you let it keep running. The salary will always feel like the answer. It is visible. It is predictable. It arrives on a schedule. But the asset, built slowly and left alone, is the thing that will determine whether you spend the last 20 years of your working life as someone who has options or someone who has obligations. Imagine yourself at 82 years old. You are sitting somewhere comfortable. The pace of life is slowed. The urgent things that consumed 30 years of mornings are quiet now, and you are thinking back, not about the promotions, not about the raises. You will not remember the specific numbers. You will remember the feeling, the specific texture of your working years, whether you spent them with margin or without it, whether you made choices or absorbed them, whether the money you earned worked for you or whether you simply passed it along to everything the system asked you to pay for. Most people at 82 do not regret the things they did not buy. They regret the decades they spent optimizing a structure that was never going to give them what they were actually looking for. Buffett's documented philosophy comes down to one idea that does not require genius or privilege or extraordinary luck. It requires only the willingness to ask early enough whether the machine you are building will keep running when you walk away from it. The salary will not. But the asset you build alongside it, quietly, consistently, without drama, that will keep running long after the alarm clock is silent. The door has always been open. Most people just never believed they were allowed to walk through it.